Kagan, the post-war moment. The post-war moment was defined by the long boom, the Cold War, and by the liberal international order the Americans created when they built an alliance against the Soviet Union. The long boom petered out in the mid-1970s. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Empire in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The 1990s were going to be a great decade for the liberal international order. Democracy was being embraced, along with Coca-Cola, Nike and Disney, and the shopping mall and higher education in developing nations around the globe. Then Somalia and Rwanda and Bosnia reminded the world that it wasn't going to be that easy. In retrospect, maybe the peak of the liberal international order was China's ascension to the World Trade Organization in 2001. The EU expanded to 25 nations in 2004. Everywhere, nations were trying to organize themselves through multilateral institutions. Life looked so full of promise in the Clinton years. The World Wide Web, Facebook and YouTube, the rise of Amazon. The Americans had come up with something to top television. Until, once again, guess what? Another financial crash. The Great Recession, the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression. Democracy and the liberal international order have been in retreat since 2008. The jungle grows back. This book is a helpful summary of what you didn't learn enough about in high school, and which you won't start learning about unless you take out a subscription to PBS and start watching more history documentaries. Remember, PBS is television for people who went to college, and it was brought to you by Richard Nixon, who hated the network so much he was determined to set up a competitor. Now you lot, as international studies majors, ought to be aware of most of what is in this book. You will find Kagan very handy in bringing the whole story back to mind for class discussion. As educated citizens, you should know this story. Kagan is a Washington Post columnist. He's a neocon, a realist, although note, confusingly, he calls himself a liberal interventionist. Kagan is a realist, but his argument is that it's only realistic to have liberal ideals. He believes the United States ought to be realistic about its self-appointed role as the world's policeman. Kagan's argument. What was odd about the post-war period? The period 1945 to 2008 is an oddity in human history. It was when the United States was the willing guarantor of a liberal international order. We think of it as an array of quasi-legal institutions that made for political stability, but really it was about facilitating trade and rebuilding economies after World War II. For Kagan, the big miracle of the post-war moment is the United States occupying and democratizing Japan, Germany and Korea. This was when the United States took the fateful decision to maintain an overwhelming superiority in arms over any other power in order to protect the hard-won peace. Conservatives went along with the policeman role because they hated communism. Kagan argues US domestic support for the liberal international order was dependent upon the Cold War. US conservatives hated communism more than taking on the role of the world's policeman. But as soon as the Cold War was over, conservatives increasingly reverted to type and campaigned for normalcy, back to the historically familiar 19th century jostling of great powers. After the Soviet Union disintegrated, conservatives lost interest in being the world's policeman. In the 1990s, this argument was pushed by Pat Buchanan. In those days, his followers were the paleo-conservatives. The paleos famously wanted the biggest army in the world, but they wanted to keep it at home and avoid foreign entanglements. In a nod to the paleos, in 2000, neoconservative George W. Bush responded to President Clinton's meddling in the Balkans with a promise of no more nation building. The future of American power. US intervention overseas has never been popular at home. Liberals scolded US blunders in Vietnam and Iraq. Conservatives were embarrassed by Iraq and Afghanistan and quick to move on. Kagan is critical of Obama for letting defense spending drift downwards, and especially Syria and chemical weapons in 2013, and the signal sent by Obama's failure to defend his red line. However, Kagan is even more scornful of Trump's unilateral nationalism and his scorning of America's allies. Kagan argues the US benefited the most from the liberal international order it created and sustained. Post-war periodization. In the world of international relations, focusing on the great powers, you might see three phases of the liberal international order. 1. A bipolar period, the Cold War, the 1950s to the 1980s, the United States versus the Soviet Union. 2. A unipolar period, the United States as hyperpower in the 1990s and 2000s. 3. A multipolar period, after 2008, the United States versus Russia versus China versus the European Union. The return to great power politics. After 2008, the Obama administration spared the US economy the worst by investing in the stimulus. The EU, by contrast, subjected its citizens to grinding austerity. The Germans held the purse strings tight. This was exemplified by the treatment of Greece, where American banks got German banks to lend billions, and the UK under David Cameron after 2010. The UK went from being more like Germany to more like the American Rust Belt to more like the American South. After 2016, the UK votes to leave the EU and break with its proud tradition of free trade. Trump is elected. He criticises NATO and embraces dictators. In Europe, his foreign policy favours Russia. In the Middle East, his foreign policy follows the cues of Israel and Saudi Arabia. The only traditional rival Trump is willing to confront is China. 2020. There's a pandemic during a pivotal presidential election. I mean, what are the chances? We're all in the wrong movie, right? The rise of the authoritarians. Authoritarianism, where the state is synonymous with the leader and civil society is controlled. Types of authoritarianism. Rigid, China, censorship, no opposition, no elections. Flexible, Russia, Iran, police state, controlled opposition, managed elections. Illiberal democracies, Hungary, Poland, Turkey at one end, Italy, Brazil, Trump at the other. Hallmark, where the leader intimidates journalists and is moving to control the judiciary. Populist nationalist parties, Le Pen in France, Farage in the UK, the AfD in Germany, the Five-Star League coalition in Italy, Trump's GOP, all are anti-immigrant, anti-internationalist and apocalyptic. The new authoritarianism, the rise of the strongmen since 2000. Putin ruled as president or prime minister since 1999, effectively president for life. Turkish President Erdogan, prime minister 2003 to 14, now president, a long period of successful reform followed by the split with Gulen in 2013. The Turkish army is now in Syria fighting the Kurds. Viktor Orban in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party in Poland on the road to putting nationalist parties in charge of the state and creating constitutional dictatorships. Duterte of the Philippines, 2016, notorious for licensing the extrajudicial murder of drug dealers. Chinese President Xi, 2013, now president for life. What they have in common? The leader becomes the state. They use the law and state apparatus for their own ends. Everything is about them. They control public debate. They rig elections and jail and even assassinate their critics. They make use of spectacles like show trials. Media strategy. They control what the masses see on television and bottle up liberal dissent on the internet. They rule through fear and the mantra, "Only I can save you." The rise of the illiberal democracies. The formula, control television and the judiciary. In Hungary and Poland, it's fear of liberal multiculturalism and refugees. Other liberal democracies such as Italy, Spain, Germany, Britain, Australia, the United States and Israel all have parties whose leaders would like to police journalists and judges. The rise of nationalist parties in liberal democracies. In Canada and Australia in the 2000s, extractivism under Stephen Harper and Tony Abbott, a politics based on hostility to environmentalism and immigrants. The National Front in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, UKIP under Nigel Farage, its fear of Muslims and the European Union. In the United States, the Tea Party, 2010, the revolt of white conservatives against a black president, raging about immigration and illegals. The Brexit, 2016, stunning upset in the home of liberal economics. Trump, 2016, leading with America first and an attempt to turn America away from its own system of international alliances. What the nationalists have in common: anti-globalization in the context of unyielding austerity and automation, anti-Muslim in the context of Middle East terrorism in Europe, anti-European Union, portrayed as a liberal elitist conspiracy in Brussels, much as Washington is portrayed as a liberal elitist conspiracy in the United States. Populist, whatever's popular, ideologically incoherent, issues appropriated to mobilize voters and often simply for the sake of starting an argument. Pujadist, movement of 1950s French petty bourgeoisie, shopkeepers caught up in nostalgia for the past, many echoes in the decades to come. Anti-elitist, especially in the wake of austerity, left and right castigate bailing out banks, and neoliberalism. Neoliberals are like hipsters, a classic out-group. Notice they're supposed to be everywhere, but you've never met one. The society of the spectacle, people perpetually caught up in the outrage of the moment, of, insert atrocity, go viral. Internet enabled, social media to mobilize supporters, turn them out for rallies, get them to stand in elections, the low cost and local alternative to national newspapers and television. Don't underestimate how important social media has been to the political chaos we've been living through. It's played the role radio did with fascism in the 1930s and television news did with Vietnam in the 1960s. Kagan's take: authoritarianism is a more natural form of government, like monarchy with symbolic elections of the king. Liberal democracy is much harder to maintain because it requires a consensual political culture, or in a conflictual political culture like the United States and the UK, a cross-party agreement on foreign policy. Why is authoritarianism on the march now? The 2008 crash, the burden of adjustment was imposed on lower income borrowers. Rising inequality and the erosion of the middle class. Education and home ownership are far more expensive now. Social media and trolling. Viewpoints that were once marginalized now command their own platforms and can suppress critics via online mobbing. Extractivism, Naomi Klein's term, oil and gas, construction, the machine versus climate change. Remember the soy and concrete questions. Why is liberal democracy so fragile? Kagan argues because it's so hard to sustain. You need economic development, political consensus, and respect for human rights. The takeaway from Kagan is that the liberal international order was the creature of a political moment, defined by the Cold War. Once that overarching conflict was over, the chief guarantor of that order, its architect and superintendent, the United States, began to lose interest. 9/11 briefly revived that interest, but only at the expense of two cruel and punishing never-ending wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. By 2016, enough of the American public had long forgotten the point, way back in the 1990s, of Bill Clinton uniting NATO against Milosevic in Yugoslavia. By the 2010s, any intervention in foreign conflict seemed to threaten another Afghanistan or Iraq. State capacity. Suggestion: in the wake of the pandemic, we can see this more clearly. Rather than thinking about whether a nation is a democracy or not, we should focus on its state capacity. What is it capable of doing for its citizens? Remember, the United Arab Emirates places below the United States and the United Kingdom in the Fragile States Index and is closer to Finland. Types of state in the 2020s. Liberal, the works, Scandinavia, Holland, New Zealand. Illiberal, stacking the judiciary, pegging back civil rights, strong-arming the media, Poland, Hungary, Philippines, India. Authoritarian, rigged elections, fixed, China versus flexible, Iran and Russia. Blocked, perpetual elections, Britain with Brexit, the United States with its perpetually divided Congress, nations with unstable governments and frequent elections, Israel, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Australia. Fragmented, new parties and much ideological ferment, Italy, France, Britain, Germany. Parasitical or kleptocratic, farming the people, Pakistan, Mexico, Angola. Extractive, extracting natural resources, Australia, Canada under Stephen Harper, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia. Failed, now fragile, Somalia, Afghanistan, Sudan, Syria. The lesson is that statecraft is hard. You need natural resources, an educated population, and access to capital. Don't take the achievements of liberal democracy for granted. Modernization is a difficult beast to tame. Everything has to come together to make it work. It took South Korea decades to do what the United States and the United Kingdom took a century to achieve. China has gone further and faster still. Modernization is far from finished. Now modernization has to adapt to the way modernization itself has changed the Earth's climate. Australia. The story of the armed lifeboat in the liberal democracies begins down under after 9/11 in Australia with the Big Dry, the biggest drought in the short history of European colonisation. Australia's agriculture in the Mediterranean climate of the southeast was wiped out. You can read about it in Fishman. Australia became dependent on its exports of iron ore and coal to China. Look at this map of Australia at night from Apple Maps. The cities are the bright blobs in the southeast and up along the east coast, and that's Perth in the southwest. So what's that in the northwest corner where no one lives? Yes, that's the lights of open-cast mines, and that's how big they are. It's called extractivism, where the state becomes dependent on the extraction of natural resources. See the Canadian social theorist and environmental activist Naomi Klein. This produced a lot of instability and turbulence in Australian politics. Parties kept opposing their own leaders. Every 3 years Australia would have an election and climate change would be the big issue, and rural Australians kept voting to mine the coal and iron ore. Australia became world renowned for its hostility to boat people, refugees making the crossing by sea. Australia made an asylum colony out of Nauru, an island in the Pacific. When Trump came into office, one of the first things he did was torpedo an agreement with Obama to take some of the refugees. He claimed it would make him look weak with his people. That kind of politics, based on scapegoating outsiders, actually came to power in America later on in the process. Because of the country's immigrant traditions and the fact that America is indisputably a nation built by immigrants and from all over the world, that kind of politics induced a more vigorous and sustained counter-reaction in the United States than anywhere else. How did Trump change American foreign policy? He distanced the US from NATO and feuded with the leaders of France, Germany and Canada. He supported Britain's exit from the EU. He refused to condemn Putin's excesses even after Putin tried to poison the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. He started a trade war with China. In the Middle East, he did the bidding of the Israelis and the Saudis and the Turks at every turn. In the Saudi case, he turned a blind eye to the killing of a Washington Post correspondent by the de facto ruler of the country. He betrayed the Kurds in Syria, and he continued American complicity in the famine in Yemen. Normally with American presidents, I make the point that their foreign policy runs along the rails laid down by their predecessors. I used to talk about the way Richard Nixon set the direction for his successors and the way America was at the peak of its powers under Bill Clinton. But Donald Trump's foreign policy was discontinuous with all of his post-war predecessors. It's true to say that going into the 2020 election, Americans were divided about Trump, but it's important to recognize that the rest of the world was not. America lost stature in Iraq and Afghanistan under Bush. It recovered standing under Obama. They gave him the Nobel Peace Prize before he had the chance to screw up in Syria. But it lost even more standing under Trump, who was seen, to put it politely, as a vain and unpredictable leader. He had big fans in Moscow and Jerusalem and Riyadh and London, of course, but elsewhere he was taken about as seriously as Berlusconi and Bolsonaro, his closest relatives in the political firmament. People for whom it would be funny if it weren't so serious. Men with the spirit to lead, but without the intellect to wield their authority purposefully. Think of the decades-long strategy involved in China's major foreign policy initiatives, the island building in the South China Seas and the Belt and Road Initiative across Eurasia. This is Xi thinking 30 and 50 years ahead. In the meantime, America has had a leader fixated on tomorrow's television ratings. Now compare that to America's retreat, attempting to divide rather than unite Europe, the signal sent around the world by another American betrayal of the Kurds, and the way the world's dictators, Putin, Netanyahu, Erdogan, Mr. Bonesaw, and North Korea's dictator, have been able to manipulate Trump for their own ends. For the rest of the world, the Americans like the British. Great powers brought to their knees by the torrent of decadence unleashed by Facebook and YouTube. Everyone else's attitude is, see, the Americans are just as clueless as the rest of us. And for everyone else's rulers, we've got to get hold of the internet quick, or it will happen here.